The gate creaks open, and for a moment, nobody on Miller Ridge Road says a word. Then someone laughs. Not a friendly laugh, a disbelieving one. Because right now, in the most valuable vineyard in the whole valley, 200 sheep are pouring through the gate, like water finding a crack in a dam. Woolbacks bobbing between rows of grapevines, worth more per acre than most people's homes. Neighbors stand at the fence line with their arms crossed, watching a 26-year-old woman named Emma Calloway do something nobody in 3 generations of grape growing on this land has ever dared to try. "She's going to lose the whole vineyard," mutters a voice from the crowd. Emma doesn't look back. She just watches her flock move into the rows, and for the first time in a year, she looks like she can breathe. To understand why she's standing in that field, risking everything her family built, you have to go back 11 months, to the day everything fell apart. Calloway Vineyard had survived droughts, frosts, and 2 recessions. What it hadn't survived was a phone call on a rainy Tuesday in March, telling Emma that her father, Walter Calloway, had suffered a stroke while checking irrigation lines before sunrise. Emma was living 2 states away, working a stable job in agricultural logistics, the kind of career that made her father proud in that quiet way farmers are proud. Never saying much, just nodding when her name came up. She hadn't planned on coming home. She hadn't planned on inheriting 40 acres of Cabernet and Syrah vines either. But family crises don't wait for good timing. She moved home to help her father recover, and, without really deciding to, found herself running the vineyard herself. Within weeks, she understood the second crisis hiding behind the first one. The vineyard was bleeding money. Diesel prices had climbed. Labor costs for mowing and weeding crews had nearly doubled. Herbicide prices kept rising, along with new restrictions on when and how they could be sprayed. Every pass of the tractor between the rows cost fuel, time, and wear on equipment that was already older than Emma herself. She sat at her father's kitchen table one night with a stack of invoices and a calculator, and the number staring back at her wasn't just discouraging, it was frightening. At this rate, in 2 years, the vineyard wouldn't be worth saving. That night, unable to sleep, she started reading. Not vineyard trade magazines, soil science. Regenerative agriculture, livestock integration. She found something called targeted grazing, where sheep are used seasonally in vineyards and orchards to manage weeds, cut mowing costs, and improve soil health, all while the vines are dormant or between vulnerable growth stages. It sounded almost too simple, too good to be true. She brought it up at breakfast the next morning, half expecting her father to wave it off from his recliner. He didn't wave it off. He just went quiet for a long moment and finally said, "Your grandfather used to talk about running sheep through the orchard rows before my time. Never tried it myself. Too risky." "Everything feels risky right now, Dad," Emma said. He studied her for a long time. Then he said the words that would change everything. One section, the old East Block. If it goes wrong, it goes wrong small. Word travels fast in a small farming community, and not always kindly. Frank Delgado had been growing grapes on the neighboring property for almost 40 years. He'd known Emma since she was a kid, riding her bike down the gravel road between their 2 farms. He also had strong opinions, and he didn't hold back. "Sheep will eat every leaf off those vines," he told her at the local feed store, loud enough for 3 other people to hear. "They'll strip the bark off young trunks. They'll compact your soil until nothing grows right for years. You're going to hand your father's life's work over to a flock of animals that don't know the difference between a weed and a $100 bottle of wine." Emma had done her research. She knew the difference between reckless grazing and managed grazing, the kind where timing, fencing, stocking density, and vine height all mattered enormously. But standing in that feed store, none of that research made her feel any less like the whole valley was watching her, waiting for her to fail. "We'll see," was all she said. She went home and read her notes twice that night. Then she called a livestock supplier 2 counties over. The first sheep arrived on a cold morning in late November, right after harvest, when the vines had gone dormant and their leaves had dropped. This timing mattered. Dormant vines have no leaves for sheep to eat, and their trunks, if properly protected, are far less vulnerable than during the growing season. Emma had read enough to know the plan. Rotate the sheep through small sections using temporary electric fencing. Move them every few days, and let them graze down the weeds and cover crops between the rows before the spring growth cycle began. Their manure would return nutrients to the soil naturally. Their grazing would reduce the need for mowing and herbicide. Fewer tractor passes meant less compacted soil and less diesel burned. On paper, it made sense. In practice, it required something no article could teach her: instinct, built from experience she didn't yet have. The first 2 weeks went reasonably well. The sheep grazed steadily, and Emma watched with cautious hope as the weeds between the vines disappeared, replaced by neat, clipped rows of bare earth and manure. Then came the mistake that nearly ended the whole experiment before it began. A section of temporary fencing had been staked too close to a row of 2-year-old vines, young enough that their trunks hadn't hardened yet. Overnight, a handful of curious sheep found their way past the fence line and stripped bark from 6 young vines before Emma discovered it at dawn. 6 vines, 2 full growing seasons of care, gone in one night. She stood there in the frost, staring at the damage, feeling something twist in her stomach. It wasn't just the loss of the vines. It was the fear that Frank Delgado had been right all along. Word got around fast. By that afternoon, 3 different neighbors had heard about the vine damage, and each version of the story had grown a little worse in the telling. Then the rain came. A week of heavy November storms turned the grazed sections of the vineyard into thick, sucking mud. The sheep's hooves churned the wet soil, and for a few days it looked less like regenerative farming and more like a disaster. Emma spent hours in rubber boots, moving fencing, checking for foot rot, worrying about erosion. And then, one night, something worse happened. A neighbor's dog, or possibly a coyote, nobody was ever certain, got into the flock. Emma woke to frantic bleating and ran outside in the dark with a flashlight to find 2 ewes injured and the rest of the flock scattered and terrified. That was the night she sat on the porch steps at 2 a.m., exhausted, muddy, and crying quietly, so her father wouldn't hear her through the window. The following week, Emma sat down with the numbers again. Vet bills for the injured ewes, replacement costs for the damaged vines, extra fencing materials. Her carefully built budget for the experiment had already blown past what she'd projected for the entire season. She talked to her father one evening, the accounting spreadsheet open between them. Maybe Frank was right, she admitted. Maybe I moved too fast. Maybe this whole idea was a mistake. Her father was quiet for a long moment, the way he always was, before saying something that mattered. Every good decision I ever made on this land looked like a mistake somewhere in the middle, he said. The question isn't whether it's hard right now. The question is whether the reason you started still makes sense. Emma sat with that for a long time after he went to bed. The reason still made sense. The vineyard was still losing money the old way. She just hadn't given the new way enough time to prove itself. She decided to keep going, but smarter. Tighter fencing checks every evening, a livestock guardian dog to protect against predators, a revised rotation schedule that kept sheep further from young vines until their bark had fully hardened. If you've ever poured your time and money into something everyone around you said would fail, you already know that feeling, where you can't tell anymore if you're being brave or being foolish. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever lived through a moment like that yourself. Winter eased into spring, and slowly, without fanfare, the vineyard began telling a different story. The weed pressure in the grazed sections was noticeably lower than in the untouched rows. and dramatically lower than in Frank Delgado's vineyard next door, where his crew was already back to weekly mowing and spraying. Emma hadn't run her mower through the East Block once all season. She started noticing things she hadn't expected. Kneeling in the soil one afternoon, she found earthworms, more of them than she remembered seeing in years. The ground itself felt different underfoot, softer, looser, easier to sink a trowel into. Wildflowers began appearing between the rows, something the old, heavily mowed and sprayed sections never produced. Bees and beneficial insects followed the wildflowers. Her diesel expenses for the East Block had dropped by more than half compared to the previous year, simply because there were far fewer tractor passes needed for mowing. Her fertilizer costs began falling too. The manure from months of grazing was doing quiet, steady work she hadn't fully appreciated until she saw the receipts. None of it happened overnight, and none of it felt miraculous. It felt earned. The slow, unglamorous payoff of patience and careful management. The kind of change you almost miss if you're not paying close attention. By early summer, the vines in the grazed section were pushing out healthy new growth. Not spectacular, not dramatic, just healthy, in a way that made Emma stop and really look, more than once. The following summer brought the driest conditions the valley had seen in almost a decade. Fuel prices spiked again. Across the region, vineyard owners were running tractors overtime, trying to keep weeds under control, in punishing heat, watching their irrigation costs climb as the ground dried out and hardened. Emma's East Block told a different story. The improved soil structure, loosened by months of grazing and enriched by natural manure, held moisture longer than the compacted, heavily tilled sections nearby. Her vines showed less drought stress. Her fuel and labor costs stayed low because she still wasn't mowing that section more than a few times a season. Word finally started to shift. A few local growers, watching their own maintenance bills climb during the driest months, began asking quiet questions about what Emma was doing differently. And then, one afternoon, in late July, Frank Delgado's truck pulled up her driveway. Emma braced herself for another lecture. Instead, Frank walked out to the East Block, crouched down, and pressed his hand into the soil, the way farmers do when they're really looking, not just glancing. "How are you rotating them?" he asked. "What's your stocking rate per acre? How long before you know a vine's ready to handle grazing again?" Emma answered every question. Fencing, timing, protection for young trunks. Lessons learned from that first hard winter. Frank listened the way he'd never listened to her before. "I was wrong," he finally said. "I judged this before I understood it." If you've ever been doubted by the people you respected most, and then watched them come around, you know exactly how that moment felt for Emma. It's the kind of win that means more than any harvest number ever could. By the following autumn, 3 neighboring vineyards had started planning their own grazing programs for the off-season. Frank was one of them. The same people who had stood at Emma's fence line laughing when the sheep first walked through the gate were now calling her for advice on fencing suppliers and grazing schedules. Nothing about it felt like revenge to Emma. It felt like relief. The quiet, steady kind that comes when something you believed in turns out to actually work, and other people finally see it too. On a cool evening in late fall, Emma found her father sitting on the porch, looking out over the vineyard, the way he had 1,000 times before his stroke. Except now, sheep grazed peacefully between the dormant vines in the fading light. "Your grandfather would have liked this," Walter said as she sat down beside him. "Everyone thought I was wasting the land," Emma said, "using it for sheep instead of grapes." Her father shook his head slowly. "You weren't wasting it. You found a way to make the same 40 acres do more than one job at a time. That's not wasting land, Emma. That's understanding it." They sat together in silence, watching the flock move slowly through the rows as the sun dropped behind the hills. Innovation on the land doesn't always come from buying more acreage, bigger machines, or expensive new technology. sometimes it comes from looking at what you already have and asking a question nobody else was willing to ask. Emma didn't need a bigger vineyard. She needed to see the one she already had a little differently. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. We bring you real stories of people who bet everything on an idea nobody else believed in, and we've got more of them coming. And before you go, tell us in the comments where you're watching this from tonight, and if you've ever been in a moment like Emma's, where everyone around you said you were making a mistake. We'd love to hear your story.